Welcome to Fairy Tale. Get ready to dive into the most fascinating, shocking, and true-to-life stories. From unsolved mysteries and gripping crimes to inspiring survival tales, it's all here. Subscribe now and step into the world of reality like never before.
That night, that cursed night. I know I'll never forget it. Looking back, maybe I should have understood the warnings, the feeling tugging at me not to board that bus. But I didn't listen. I need to tell you about that night, about the hours I spent beside that stranger. Maybe it'll help me put it behind me. People who know me see me as brave and grounded. I moved to a big city young, live on my own, and don't think twice about walking the city's empty streets late at night. But during that journey, I found myself beyond terrified, my heart and mind shadowed by fears I couldn't understand. In one strange, awful night, a stranger I'd never met altered my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. The whole week had been exhausting. I was drowning in work, overwhelmed by the never-ending demands of city life. It was then that I decided to leave it all behind and spend the weekend in Izmir, with my family, in the warmth and familiarity of home. Mom's soup, Dad's stories, nothing else could ground me so completely. So, without thinking twice, I grabbed the last ticket on the midnight bus. Seat 23, with a stranger beside me. The terminal was unusually quiet for Istanbul. The hollow sounds of footsteps and distant announcements echoed off the walls as I waited alone at my platform. Just 5 minutes left until departure. I'd been feeling uneasy all evening, but I'd chalked it up to the fact that it was the dead of night. Finally, the bus pulled up. The drivers and attendants bustled about, loading luggage and directing passengers. As I walked down the aisle to my seat, I spotted the empty spot beside me. Great, I thought, maybe I'll have the row to myself. But no sooner had I sat down than a man arrived and took the seat next to mine. He seemed ordinary enough, a tall figure in a dark coat, with a slightly slouched posture, his head tilted down. His face was partly hidden by shadows, making his features hard to see. With a jolt, the bus started moving, and we were on our way. At first, I barely paid attention to him. But after a few minutes, I noticed a strange odor, something earthy and damp, like wet soil mixed with an old, musty scent. It made me wrinkle my nose. I thought maybe it was just a faint smell from outside, that it would soon fade. But it lingered, hanging heavily around him, and only grew stronger the further we went. I turned toward the window, hoping sleep would take me before the odor could bother me too much. I tried to relax, listening to the hum of the engine, but a growing sense of discomfort weighed on me. I felt him staring. That prickling feeling of someone's eyes on you, even when you're not looking, it was unmistakable. I turned slightly to see if I was imagining it, and sure enough, his gaze was fixed right on me. His eyes were the strangest I'd ever seen, so black and empty, yet somehow deeply unsettling, as though they held secrets I was better off not knowing. "Hello," I said, more out of nervousness than courtesy. I immediately regretted it, wishing I could take back the word. He didn't respond. He kept staring, his gaze cold and unyielding. I looked away, hoping he'd get the hint, but I could still feel those eyes on me, pressing down on me like a weight. I could almost hear something, a low murmur, like a barely audible whisper in a language I didn't understand. I strained to listen, wondering if he was talking to himself, but the sound was too faint. Still, it seeped into my mind, filling my thoughts with a strange sense of unease. By now, I was on edge. Trying to ignore him was useless. His presence seemed to fill the air around me, and I couldn't escape it. The bus was still winding through the empty roads of the night, the only sound the rhythm of the tires against the pavement. Outside, the dark was absolute. I couldn't make out a single landmark or light. But the quiet was broken by that whispering again, creeping into my mind as if it came from within. It was then that images from my past began to flash before me, memories I hadn't thought of in years, surfacing one by one. I saw myself as a child, in the backyard of my old home, watching a huge black crow staring at me from a tree. I remember feeling its gaze, dark and intense, following my every move. That same gaze was in the man's eyes now, and the weight of it pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. The hours dragged on in suffocating silence, interrupted only by the strange, incomprehensible whispering that grew louder as the night went on. My nerves were frayed, every fiber of my being wanted to get up, to run away. But there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, with a violent jolt, the bus lurched to a halt. I heard a loud pop and the bus began to slow down, pulling over onto the shoulder. Around me, other passengers stirred, glancing around in confusion. The attendant stood up and announced that we'd blown a tire and would need a brief stop to fix it. Everyone shuffled out of the bus to stretch their legs, but I stayed inside, my eyes darting to the man. He sat still, never once looking up or acknowledging the delay. The smell around him had grown stronger now, filling the bus with an almost unbearable stench. I found myself edging toward the aisle, my body tense, ready to flee at the slightest hint of movement. Finally, the driver got the tire fixed, and everyone piled back in. I sank into my seat, hoping the rest of the journey would pass quickly, but as soon as we started moving, I could sense him leaning closer, as if he'd been waiting for the darkness to fall again. My mind was racing. Was it paranoia? Or was he actually getting closer? I turned to him, ready to say something, anything to make him stop staring, when he suddenly leaned in and whispered, "You'll never forget me." I froze. His voice was rough, like stones scraping together, each word clawing its way out of his throat. My body went cold, a shiver running down my spine. Somehow, I knew he was right. I'd never forget that voice, that smell, those eyes, those horrible, empty eyes that seemed to burn right through me. The bus finally entered the city as dawn was breaking, casting a soft glow over the streets. But the light did nothing to chase away the darkness that seemed to linger around him. When we reached the terminal, I quickly gathered my things, my only thought to get as far away from him as possible. But as I turned to leave, he caught my arm in a cold, iron grip. His fingers were ice, sending a chill through my skin. "Remember," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't over." Then he let go, leaving me numb and shaken. I stumbled off the bus, never once looking back. But even as I walked away, I could still feel his gaze on me, as if he were watching, waiting for me to turn around. A week had passed since that night, but the memory of it clung to me like a second shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, his face was there, hovering just beyond reach, his voice whispering in that same bone-chilling tone. I kept telling myself it was just a bad dream, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever happened on that bus was real. I went back to work, trying to bury myself in the usual routine. But the smallest things would startle me: a cold draft, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a whisper of sound when I was alone. My coworkers noticed I was jumpier than usual, but I brushed off their concerns, making excuses to avoid talking about that night. One evening, just as I was starting to relax, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. The rational part of me wanted to ignore it, but something inside me knew who it was before I even picked up. I answered, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Hello." There was silence on the other end, and then, the sound of breathing. Slow, steady, chilling. I could almost feel him on the other end, watching me from wherever he was. "You didn't forget me, did you?" The voice was unmistakable, rough, hollow, and laced with a sinister amusement. It was him. I froze, unable to move or speak. "I warned you, didn't I?" he continued. "I told you, this isn't over." I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short gasps. My heart raced, hammering against my chest. I locked my doors, checked every window, and turned on every light. But no amount of light could erase the darkness settling over me. He was somewhere out there, and he wasn't done with me. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing his voice, replaying those words over and over in my mind. Morning came like a small relief, but exhaustion weighed me down. Somehow, I dragged myself to work, pretending that everything was fine. But inside, I felt hunted, watched, as if any moment he would appear out of nowhere. Days passed, and just when I was beginning to think maybe he'd moved on, I saw him. I was walking home late, cutting through an alleyway to save time. As I turned the corner, there he was, standing in the shadows, his dark coat blending into the night. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was watching me with those same black, empty eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. He took a step toward me, and instinct took over. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty alley, the sound of his steady footsteps close behind. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. All I could think of was escape. Somehow, I made it to my apartment building and slammed the door behind me, locking it and stumbling backward, my chest heaving. I waited, listening, but the silence was suffocating. When I finally dared to look out the window, the alley was empty. The police didn't take me seriously. "Probably just someone messing with you," they said. "He probably thought you were someone else." They brushed it off, filing a half-hearted report, and told me to let them know if it happened again. But I knew this was no case of mistaken identity. He was after me, and he wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted, whatever that was. Days bled into nights, and I could feel him getting closer, his presence hanging over me like a dark cloud. One night, when I was drifting between sleep and wakefulness, I heard something. Faint, at first, but unmistakable, the sound of that whisper, echoing from somewhere nearby. I bolted upright, scanning the room, my heart pounding. And there he was. Standing at the foot of my bed, his silhouette stark against the dim light. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me with that same, eerie smile. "What do you want?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. His smile widened, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "I told you. You'll never forget me." I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, hoping he'd disappear. When I opened them again, he was gone. But the fear, the cold dread that had seeped into my bones, remained. I was trapped, haunted by a presence that felt like it had wormed its way into my very soul. The next morning, I found something on my bedside table that hadn't been there before, a single black feather. It was sleek and shiny, with a strange iridescence that caught the light. I shivered, remembering the crow from my childhood, the one that had watched me with such intensity. Had he left it there as a message? A warning? By now, my mind was a constant whirl of paranoia and dread. I tried to focus on work, on anything to distract myself, but every time I felt even a hint of calm, he'd find a way to shatter it. A whispered voice in an empty room, a glimpse of a dark figure in the distance, a shadow just beyond my line of sight. He was everywhere, and there was no escape. One evening, desperate for answers, I found myself in the city library, searching through old records, newspapers, anything that might explain who, or what, he was. But there was nothing. No reports of strange encounters, no records of unexplained phenomena. It was as if he'd appeared out of thin air, a ghost haunting only me. Just when I thought I was losing my mind, I stumbled upon an old article buried in the archives. It told the story of a man who had died in a tragic accident on a bus, his body never found. According to the legend, he had become a shadow, cursed to wander between worlds, seeking out those who would remember him, haunting them until they, too, were lost. My blood ran cold as I read those words. It couldn't be. But deep down, I knew it was true. I was his next victim, drawn into a nightmare I couldn't escape. As I left the library, the lights flickered, and I felt his presence again, closing in around me. I knew he was near. I broke into a run, my breath ragged, my heart pounding, but no matter how fast I ran, he was always there, just out of reach, a shadow in the corner of my eye. Back at my apartment, I locked every door, every window, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I knew it was only a matter of time before he found a way in. He wasn't going to stop until he had me. That night, as I lay in bed, a final thought crept into my mind, a chilling realization. Maybe he hadn't chosen me at random. Maybe he'd been waiting, watching, waiting for the right moment to make himself known. The lights flickered again, and the room grew cold. A shadow loomed over me, his face inches from mine, those black eyes boring into me, swallowing me whole. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen, held captive by his gaze. "This is just the beginning," he whispered, his voice wrapping around me like a shroud. "You're mine now." And as his shadow closed in, I felt myself slipping away, sinking into a darkness that seemed endless, a cold that seeped into my very soul. The last thing I saw was his smile, wide and terrible, as the world faded to black.